Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the NHC Summer Series on Patient-Centered Value Assessment and Alternatives to the QALY, a four-part webinar series. Today's launch of this webinar series is titled Patient Primer, Exploring the Foundations of Patient-Centered Value Assessment. For those of you that don't know me, I am Dr. Maris Contreras, and I am the Senior Vice President of Equity Research and Programs at the National Health Council. So today it is a pleasure to have wonderful speakers lined up to really give us a sense of who we are and why our patients so important to be involved in the value assessment process. But for those of you who are new to the NHC or are not familiar, we are an organization over 100 years old that brings diverse organizations together primarily to forge consensus and drive patient-centered health policy forward. We are made up of more than 180 national health-related organizations, with a main core of that membership including the nation's leading patient organizations. For those of you who may have questions about membership, we welcome and love to hear from you. So please make sure to contact the NHC's membership team at membership@nhcouncil.org. Next slide, please. As mentioned, here's the core of our patient membership organization. As you can tell, that we have a breadth of numerous dedicated leaders in the healthcare ecosystem that are dedicated to really putting the patient voice at the center of all of our processes. So your timely and your expertise cannot be more important than now. Next slide, please. So today's agenda, I would like to, today we'll have an introduction on just patient-centered value assessment. So we'll hear what does exactly that means, and there'll be some examples as well, given the newly Inflation Reduction Act and some examples from that. And two, we'll have a case example on how do we mitigate these evidence gaps and what tools are currently in existence to inform patient-centered value assessment. And of course, like all of our webinars and all of our initiatives at the National Health Council, we'll also hear the patient perspective on value assessment. And at the end, we'll also have a couple of minutes for Q&A. But I also know that our wonderful Chief Executive Officer, Randy Ruda, is on the call. So Randy, I would just like to if you want to take the moment just to welcome and say a couple remarks, please.
Absolutely. Thank you, Omar. And I'll just really serve as a cheerleader for today's session and really this whole series. You know, throughout my career as an advocate for people with disabilities, people with chronic conditions, who are looking to get the best possible outcomes in the healthcare that they receive. That has always had as part of that conversation this idea of patient-centered value assessment. And I'm just so thrilled that the National Health Council has historically played the role that it has in helping inform that conversation and make sure that patients truly do understand and benefit from the consideration of value in our healthcare ecosystem. So I just am thrilled that everyone is gathered here for this call and will participate in the series as it goes forward. Such a critical issue where patients have such a significant stake. And I think with all of us coming together in this way, having this conversation, we will ensure that value assessment truly is patient-informed and patient-centered, and that ultimately the benefit will fall to the patients in a way that's responsible and sustainable in our healthcare ecosystem. So thank you all for your participation today and for your interest and contribution to this really, really important topic. So Omar, thanks for that opportunity to say hello.
Of course. Thank you, Randy. A couple housekeeping items. Please keep yourself on mute during the webinar. This is a forum for discussion, so we may be touching on concepts and issues that may have different views among our stakeholders, so please remain kind. And during the Q&A at the end, please submit your comments to the Q&A function of Zoom, and also feel free to add your comments to the chat during the webinar as we'll be monitoring those comments. Next slide, please. In 2016, the NHC launched its original Value Classroom with a grant from the QALY and the Eugene Washington Award Program. This classroom's intent was to assist patient organizations to get ready for value assessment. We know that a lot has changed in the field since then. In 2023 and in 2024, the NHC received funding to revamp its Value Classroom and launch new tools, webinars, infographics on patient-centered value assessment, and other things. Our amazing value work group, which is mainly comprised of our NHC member patient organizations. They provided comments, publication, updates to this work, and also how best we can enhance the new literature, what's new, what's innovative. And you see many of you on the call today, including, of course, one of our speakers today, Anna Hyde from the Arthritis Foundation. We will be launching this updated classroom in October, so stay tuned. I would also like to acknowledge our sponsors for this fabulous work, Sanofi, Genentech, and Merck. Thank you so much for the opportunity and for really being true leaders and understanding and valuing the patient into value assessment. Next slide, please. You can see that other webinars for this series here, they will be focused primarily on alternatives to the QALY. This is by no means an endorsement to any of the specific alternatives. It's more primarily as an educational purpose for our patient organizations to really understand what is the lingo, what is the new methodology that we should be thinking about if we are approached by a value assessor, or we know that we have to participate in a value assessment. So we want to make sure that we provide and demystify some of these misconceptions that are on these alternative methodologies. So again, it's not necessarily endorsement, but more so of an educational opportunity for us to put forward what are these additional methodologies. So we'll provide the link to the additional registration for those webinars upcoming in the next series of weeks. So we go to the next slide, please. So we like to get some engagement from all of you before we start. So I like to ask a question about what type of organization are you representing today? So if you could please, you could log into your Slido here using slido.com. You type in hashtag 2976538, or you could also just review from your scan code. Then I'll just give you a minute to help you respond, and your data and your input is greatly appreciated, just to know who's currently present. Fantastic. So most of them are patient organizations. We have some members from business industry, manufacturers, research nonprofits. We'll give you about 15 more seconds or so. Excellent. And we have one more Slido question for you. Please, how have you interacted? How has you as a participant have interacted with value assessment institutions or assessors? So the options are: my organization has sat actively a treatment under value assessment, they have participated, has responded or submitted, has had some sort of interactions. So again, I think this is important for us to figure out who's in the audience, as well as how does this benefit the NHC to continue developing its tools. Great. Well, thank you so much for your input, and we will definitely take this into consideration. And again, just appreciate all of you for being here with us this morning. So now it is my pleasure to introduce our speakers for today. I had the pleasure of working with many of our speakers today, and I think you will, you're in for a treat to really help us center ourselves, no pun intended, on patient-centered value assessment. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Joey Manley. He is an associate professor and vice chair of research for the Department of Pharmacotherapy at the University of Utah College of Pharmacy, and also a longstanding friend of the NHC. His research portfolio primarily focused on drug pricing policy, health economics, patient engagement, where he has engaged policymakers at the local, state, and federal levels. Dr. Mattingly serves as a temporary advisor to the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, also known as CMS, to aid in the implementation of the new drug price negotiation program authorized under the Inflation Reduction Act, and was also named a research fellow for the National Association of Insurance Commissioners And in 2024, he was appointed to lead pharmacy benefit strategy for the University of Utah Health Plan, which represents over 3,000 employees at the University of Utah. So welcome, Dr. Mattingly. Dr. QALY Majorchek, she is currently a postdoc research scientist at Clinical Outcome Solutions. Her research interest includes patient-centered outcomes research, patient-reported outcomes, patient experience data, and mixed methods research. QALY has worked with data analytics as a consultant in Humana using claims data, and her work is also focused on informing market leaders with population-level analytics to support Humana's bold goal communities initiatives towards improving members' health. At the University of Maryland, Baltimore, QALY and her research were focused in, her dissertation was focused primarily on co-developing a disease-agnostic survey template, which we'll hear about more today, and that template, how it helps patient-centered evidence to identify patient-centered evidence gaps in U.S. value assessment. And also, we are proud as the National Health Council to have supported this through her pre-doctoral fellowship. And then lastly, Ms. Anna Hyde. She is the Vice President of Advocacy and Access at the Arthritis Foundation, and also, of course, a member of the National Health Council. She oversees both the federal and state legislative programs, in addition to grassroots engagement. Her focus is to raise the visibility of arthritis as a public health priority, build support for federal and state legislation that ensures access to affordable, high-quality healthcare, and enhance patient engagement in the policymaking process. Prior to joining the Arthritis Foundation in 2014, Anna served as a senior manager for federal affairs at the American Congress of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and where she also managed a portfolio issue including appropriations, physician workforce, and health IT. So I am looking forward to all of you and in the discussion. So Dr. Mattingly, I will pass it on to you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Omar. And you can go ahead to the next slide, and actually one more slide after that. Well, since Omar did such a fantastic introduction. Yes, I'm at the University of Utah, and I see a lot of friendly and familiar names on the webinar, so excited to see many of you again. The National Health Council has been instrumental in making sure the patient voice is at the table in these value discussions. I had the fortune of getting to work with the National Health Council early on in the classroom development, and 10 years ago. And it's been amazing seeing the growth and what we've been able to do, getting the patient voice to the table. We've come a long way, I guess we should say, and many of the folks on this call today have been instrumental in that. So what I want to do is try to set the stage with the idea of where all this stuff comes from. I guess I'll boil down a PhD in health economics into a couple of slides as best I can, at least for cost effectiveness. When we talk about cost effectiveness and value assessment, cost effectiveness is essentially a tool that we use to try to understand if a new intervention, like a drug, is how it compares to what's currently available, right? So it's not looking at just this drug in a vacuum. It is drug A versus drug B, right? It is looking at what is that comparison. And the reason why I'm very particular about how we talk about it that way is because when we talk a little bit later about how do we compare, or how do we really get to a price of a drug, it's really important what you select as the comparator. Okay, it's really important for that, and that's where patients can be instrumental in helping us understand what is a true alternative that is reasonable and that can actually help support the patient. We typically think about the incremental cost of the new drug versus the old drug, as well as the incremental effects, or how much better the drug is for clinical effectiveness or safety or convenience. And that's sort of that gets you that ICER ratio, that incremental cost effectiveness ratio. A value assessment is a little bit broader, so often it may include a cost effectiveness analysis. It doesn't necessarily have to, but typically it would include some type of economic evaluation. And this is where you might bring in multiple different decisions. Maybe you bring in a body to vote. And so the term ICER is often used as the incremental cost effectiveness ratio in the literature. The term ICER in a value assessment framework is often referring to the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. And I think Dan Ollendorf's one of our speakers in this series. And so you'll get an awesome opportunity to hear from Dan, who is with ICER. But there's other value assessments in the US, like the American Society of Clinical Oncology, NCCN. And then outside the US, you think of value assessment frameworks maybe more formally representing the government's decision. So like CADF in Canada, NICE in the UK. So there's different value value assessment frameworks around the world. So you can go to the next slide. So the way I try to explain a cost effectiveness analysis, the economic evaluation itself, and why it's important to just kind of walk through this process with everyone on the call, because not everyone's a health economist, and you're trying to wonder, how do they come up with these $75,000 per QALY or whatever the final number is? Well, how do you get there? Well, you typically start with maybe like a literature review to see what's in the published literature, and you may or may not speak with experts as you're trying to develop your new framework for a new drug coming on the market to see where is its place in therapy, how could we value this product. The first thing that we would develop is then a base case scenario, and this is primarily done with a payer perspective. So what do I mean by a payer perspective? When a patient talks with their doctor and they decide that the best treatment for them is a medication, they get a prescription, right? They take that prescription to the pharmacy. In theory, any patient in the United States has the freedom to go buy any drug that they're prescribed from their doctor, assuming that they are paying for it themselves out of their pocket, right? But that's not as reasonable, knowing that a brand new drug is going to be maybe outside their affordability on their own, right? So many of you have car insurance. If you've had a fender bender, there's been times you've decided whether you want to pay for it out of your pocket or use your car insurance. The same thing when you use your health insurance, you take this decision from a solely patient, family, doctor decision to now you're asking a payer, a health plan. So for me, I'm an employee at the University of Utah. There are 30,000 other employees and beneficiaries in our healthcare plan. So when I want to use my health insurance to get a drug, I am asking the other 30,000 employees here at the University of Utah to chip in. And so it goes from a individual decision to a population decision. And this is sometimes the biggest crux of it all, is like when, do we want the population dictating what the patient gets, and how do we balance this push and pull? Well, this base case that economists typically work from is this payer perspective. Now the challenge here is, insurance covers a lot of different things, but maybe doesn't cover a lot of things that we as patients and caregivers recognize that maybe it should pay for, right? Some diseases cause a parent or caregiver to miss a lot of work. If that's not captured in the insurance dynamic, then we're actually missing a big part of the value of that drug. If you're keeping someone from having to go to the doctor, once a month instead of, maybe they can go every 6 months instead of once a month, or maybe we can avoid expensive testing or things like that. So sometimes that payer perspective is just so narrow that we miss a lot of really important things. And then finally, after we do our base case, we may or may not do sensitivity analyses and also subgroup analyses. So a sensitivity analysis is pretty common. We adjust our assumptions a little bit and see if it changes our answer. The subgroup analysis is I feel like we miss it so much, because in healthcare, we look at clinical trial data that's off this average population. But we know that within any clinical trial, there are groups that do better and groups that do worse, depending on different variables. Maybe it's a race or gender, socioeconomic status. Maybe it's a genetic profile. There's a lot of reasons why maybe a group of patients could really respond well to a drug, or maybe not respond well to a drug. And so it's really important for health economists to consider those subgroups, and we may not always know the best subgroups to use. So that's why it's really important to talk with patient groups to try to understand, are there cases where it's like, hey, this particular drug does really well for this group. Maybe we should carve these individuals out and redo the analysis just for the small subgroup. So you can go to the next slide. Oh, sorry. Thank you. So when we talk about this payer perspective, and this has been common, and I like to cite, this gold book, Peter Newman and Gillian Sanders, this book has been kind of like one of our main textbooks that we use to teach cost effectiveness analysis. That's and one of the main recommendations is that we should go beyond the payer perspective and report both a payer perspective and a societal perspective, or at least attempt to add those other things like caregiver costs, time missed from work, Other things that, maybe home renovations, if you have a debilitating disease that requires you to modify your house, like these are costs that often aren't captured in a traditional payer perspective. Unfortunately, to date, like still about 3 out of 4 cost effectiveness analysis published in the literature just only report the payer perspective. Why is that? Well, it's easier. It's easier to just look at claims data. It's easier to say, hey, what did the insurance pay for? Let's add all that up. It's not as easy to go beyond the payer perspective and actually talk to patients and caregivers. So it's our job with like the NHC and as advocates is what we say, all right, just because it's hard doesn't mean we can't try to do it. So anyway, this has been something I've been preaching for like a decade, and it's really hard to get across. You can go to the next slide. And when we think about the value assessments, and also ignoring payer perspectives in a lot of or ignoring the societal perspective, only focus on payer. One area that we're recognizing we're missing out a lot is that we're not addressing equity as a value attribute. So one review found about half of the value assessments around the world actually include some type of equity as an attribute. So we end up having a lack of appropriate weighting. Maybe we aren't taking into account what might be happening to some groups and individuals. And so you end up creating this maybe pay decision, like, okay, we're going to add this to the formulary, and or maybe we don't add it to the formulary, and it's based off of that overall average population. Like I was saying, maybe we failed to address one particular group that actually would do much better, and that kind of drives more health disparities. You can go to the next slide. I want to make sure we have plenty of time for all the speakers today. So I know this sounds kind of obvious, and I literally put this in a paper though recently. I was like, life is complicated. And one of my reviewers was like, yeah, no kidding. I was like, yes, it is. And navigating the daily demands for all of us can be challenging, okay? However, these daily tasks can be more taxing on disadvantaged groups with fewer resources and support. So for every disease, there are patient and caregiver experiences that just may be vastly different and shaped by circumstances that are traditional literature reviews. When you go to search academic literature, they're just not going to capture. So my question to the audience, and I say this kind of maybe rhetorical question, but like what health economists should be challenged with is figuring out ways to make sure you systematically capture as many different patient nuances that you can to help inform your model. Okay, so I think it's what I tell my students is it's not good enough to say, well, that's too hard to do. You have to like try to figure out ways to address some of these things to make sure your model addresses any potential nuances that could drive disparities. Now you can go to the next slide. And this one question I often ask is like, why is it so hard to get patients engaged in value assessments? Or why is it so hard? Why is there resistance sometimes from the community that's focusing on the economic evaluation part? Like, what's the issue? Well, a lot of papers have been published. A lot of folks have criticized the patient advocacy organizations because of potential relationships with pharmaceutical manufacturers. Maybe their goals align, like the patient group wants access to the drug and the drug company wants the patients to have access to the drug. So their goals align. And so some have accused patient groups of being biased or paid for or that sort of thing. And so my criticism back to that is like, as an academic, I have plenty of conflicts. As a health economic evaluation value assessment group, you have plenty of conflicts as well. Like it's important to disclose our conflicts, get past that and say, okay, like we notice that if goals align, if a patient group, their goals align with a pharmaceutical manufacturer, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just recognizing that may be the case. But anyway, I wanted to point that out because it's one of those elephants in the room that is frustrating to me as an academic, is that sometimes just because your goals align with like a for-profit company or a pharmaceutical manufacturer or whatever it might be, your opinions all of a sudden don't matter as much, and I think that's wrong. So you would go to the next slide. So how do we get started with patients? We work with patients to help determine the topic that we want to study. Oh, you can keep clicking so we can see all the. But patients can be useful along every step of the research process. How do we determine the comparators we use? How do we determine like the analysis approach to take? how can we ensure that what we found actually translates back to something that's useful for patients as well? You can go to the next slide. I want to show one example that we did. So this was actually part of my dissertation when I was working on my PhD years ago. Thank you again to the National Health Council, because the American Liver Foundation, at the time a NHC member, was very interested in supporting us. They helped us identify patients all across the country with hepatitis C. And we worked with a patient-centered advisory board. We combined it with a literature review, and then we did a Delphi analysis that allowed I had all Hep C patients. Some had Hep C and HIV, some different comorbidities, but a lot of different experiences with hepatitis C. And we found that, not only like curing the disease was good for the patient in terms of their future outcomes, like avoiding cirrhosis, avoiding hepatocellular carcinoma, but one of the big things that came out of it was like, even before you avoid those big, costly liver transplant type outcomes, the years that you have getting rid of the virus is important to you mentally, because you live with this fear of harming others. And what was interesting when we were talking about this in hepatitis C in 2017 and 18, this is pre-pandemic. Once COVID-19 hit, I think this message resonated with all of us, because there were a lot of us who may have been at risk for COVID-19, but maybe weren't at risk of severe effects from the virus. But that fear of harming, like one of our sick family members, or maybe one of our immunocompromised family members, that fear made us change our behaviors, so this fear of harming others was actually more important than their own physical symptoms in hep C patients. And I think talking with patients is how you can get to that answer quicker than trying to come up with it through a literature review, or you're not often going to see it in the literature. You can go to the next slide. And so I've kind of pivot. The last thing I want to talk about is why some of this matters. So the Inflation Reduction Act signed in August 2022. CMS has been working diligently on this Medicare drug price negotiation program. They're looking to seek feedback from a broad range of interested parties. So you can go to the next slide. One of the things that I've highlighted, when you look at the actual law itself, my questions to the group to think about, like, how can patient engagement be relevant to what CMS is working on based on what Congress wrote in the law? So when we talk about therapeutic advantages of existing therapies and therapeutic alternatives, my question would be, well, how do patients perceive a new advance or a new cost compared to what they currently have? Because some drug companies, or some may say, oh, for this drug, we want to compare it directly to the same class of drugs, right? Well, but that's not how diseases typically work, or how patients and physicians think. We often don't think just in one drug class. We think of multiple treatment alternatives. So it's really thinking about the broader, if you have a disease, what are your alternatives to treat it? Sometimes not treating it is the way to go as well. And should that be on the table? What other information do we have? The FDA has been engaged with patients through their PFDD initiative. Can we leverage some of that information? Also asking, were patients formally engaged in the CER process? So again, CMS is working diligently to try to get these negotiations through. I think we just saw the first list of prices. So my question is always going to be, well, how were patients engaged in that process? So I think they used their stakeholder calls, or whatever they had listening sessions. So but in the next guidance, I think they're going to do more. My guess is that they might do a little bit more to engage patients this next go around. And then finally, when we talk about an unmet need, I want to know, do patients have a say in determining whether that need's been met or not? All right, so I think is that wrapping my yeah. So I guess for the audience to think about for this, and maybe the chat box is a good place for it. My question to the group: would including more types of cost justify higher or lower prices? That's my question for you guys to maybe ponder a little bit, and you guys can throw it in the chat if you want. And then others, what other unintended consequences might there be when you incorporate the patient voice into a cost effectiveness analysis or a value assessment? And if you have those unintended consequences, what are some ways we can mitigate those as well? So with that, I think I want to make sure we turn over to the next speaker so we can hear what they've got to say. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Joey. Hi everyone. I'll be giving a case example of engaging patients to understand what matters most. This project was part of my dissertation work funded by the National Health Council. Next slide. So I just want to acknowledge them and everyone else that made this project possible, especially National Health Council and the patient organization partners, AFA, Fight CRC, and National MS Society. Next slide. So the objective of the project was to identify patient experience data concepts common across conditions to co-develop a disease agnostic survey template that informs a standardized approach to fill patient-centered evidence gaps in VHTA. Next slide. And to achieve this objective, there were three aims of the project. The first was to identify those cross-cutting concepts. 2 was to draft the survey, and then 3 was to test it. But what I want to focus on is the top of the figure, which is stakeholder engagement and patient engagement throughout the entire study process. And Joey was commenting on engaging patients. And so this is what this project was doing, engaging patients and stakeholders throughout the entire process. So next slide. 3 conditions were involved for the development and testing: asthma, colorectal cancer, and multiple sclerosis. And so again, supported by patient group partners, couldn't have done this without them. Next slide. So how were the patient experience data cross-cutting concepts identified? First, we looked at the Voice of the Patient reports. It's a great resource. We selected a random selection of 15 reports to obtain that balance of rare and prevalent conditions, and start identifying what do we see in the literature for concepts, what's common across conditions. Then to dig a little bit deeper, we conducted concept elicitation interviews with patients, 24 patients across the 3 conditions, so 8 per condition, to help generate the list of impacts reported, and also note what are condition-specific impacts, because we didn't want to forget about those as well. So these interviews were conducted via Zoom for 60 minutes, and the National Health Council, the Map My Experience visual, which you see on the right, was used to help facilitate the discussion. So the list of commonly reported impacts across conditions were created using a 70% threshold. And also we retained any impacts that were reported as most bothersome for further evaluation. So because the list was quite long of impacts, we needed to have some follow-up meetings with a subset of patients. So 12 of the 24 participated in these follow-up meetings to help really narrow down this list to understand, well, what's most important to you? And then with these impacts, understanding what aspects of that impact make it important. So for example, if we're talking about pain, is it the severity of the pain? Is it the frequency of the pain, the duration of the pain? What about pain is important? And so that's what we were really trying to figure out with these follow-up meetings. Next slide. So once we had that narrow down list of what's most important, we were able to start drafting the survey template. And so we used existing surveys that were developed by patient organizations for value assessment to see if we could adapt survey items. And then based on some of the impacts that were identified, we had to develop new items because items just did not exist. The survey was revised by stakeholder advisory board, patient advisors, and expert input before we started testing with patients. And to test with patients, we conducted cognitive debriefing interviews with 20 patients across the conditions. 4 rounds of interviews were held for revisions. And during this phase of the project, we really wanted to understand beyond, do you understand this question? It goes beyond that. It's, what's your preference for format? Do you prefer a matrix or a table style format to answering these questions? Single item? What kind of phrases do you use? What resonates with you? And then also, do we have the appropriate response options? Are we missing any response options? So it's really trying to get this right and asking questions in the right way. And again, these interviews were held via Zoom for 60 minutes, and the interviewer would share the screen to show the questions. And then after that phase of the project, it was usability testing with patients. So 16 patients participated in this phase of the project. And again, 4 rounds of interviews were held, and additional revisions were incorporated here, but they were more minor in nature. For example, formatting changes such as bolding, underlining certain words in the question, maybe adding some additional examples, to make it more clear. And then in this phase, we also captured time to complete the survey because we really wanted to understand how long it was going to take to complete. So in this particular phase, instead of the interviewer sharing the screen, the interviewer shared the link to the online version of the survey, which was developed in Qualtrics, and sent the link, and the participant would complete in real time. And so we were able to capture the time to complete, as well as other usability metrics such as relevance, understandability, the difficulty of using the system, and so forth. And after usability testing, we had this finalized survey template, as well as the condition-specific versions. So they were tailored for asthma, colorectal cancer, and MS. 31 items are contained in the survey, but there's also sub-items, because if we're asking about, did you experience these symptoms in the last 7 days? And we have the list of symptoms, those are the sub-items. So it might be pain, fatigue, trouble sleeping, etc. Next slide. So this is just an overview of the survey template content. We ask about symptoms, impacts of symptoms on daily functioning, treatment and treatment-related experiences, healthcare utilization, financial impact, healthcare provider experiences, access to healthcare and services, support from others, and so on. Next slide. So what I really want to get to is how patient engagement shaped the survey template, and I have a couple examples to share. So this first example, as I mentioned, we were trying to understand the preference for formatting. And so you see the question on the left here. This is an example of the matrix style format or the table format. And this was preferred across the board with patients. They said it was easier to respond to. They could see the full list of items. They could scroll up and down. In this particular question, it's asking, in the last 7 days, did you experience any of the things below? And this is tailored for MS. So was it related to MS or your treatments? And participants can select not sure. It's related to their condition, related to their treatment. Maybe it's both condition and treatment, or maybe they have another condition they're dealing with and they can check that box as well. So we formatted the questions as tables versus asking a single item repetitively over and over again. Next slide. The second example I have here is regarding phrasing and response options. So in this particular question, we wanted to understand if individuals had a problem, or such as a side effect or a downside of their treatment. And we originally asked this question, breaking it apart into a part A and a part B, because we thought that was simpler. But after talking with patients, they said it was confusing. They weren't really understanding what we were getting at. So we decided to combine the two, the part A and the part B, to make one question. And during this process, participants said, "You're too formal. Can you just ask the question in simple terms, just state the response, don't add please." It just felt too mechanical for them. They wanted to get it down to street level. So just ask the question. Also during this process, we got to understand the type of response options that we were missing. Originally, when we asked this question, did you have a problem or experience any of the things below? We just had no, didn't experience, not sure, yes, experience, and I stopped using the treatment, or yes, experience, and I'm still using. And a participant said, well, there's a difference of why I'm still using the treatment. It's only because I have to. And another participant said, well, yeah, I'm still using it, but it's not a big deal that I'm experiencing this side effect. So we decided to break those out into two separate response options because participants really felt that was important for us to know. And then also during this process, we got to understand how to order the items. Throughout the survey, we wanted to have this consistent format of asking about symptoms, impacts on functioning, and then any additional impacts after that. But in this particular question, participants asked, can you put costs at the top? Because that's most important to us. And what was interesting was right after we made the revision and conducted another round of interviews, participants confirmed this spontaneously of saying, oh, I'm really glad that you have cost at the top. So again, it's phrasing, it's the way you ask the questions, it's ordering, this all matters to patients. Next slide. So this is the before and the after, just to give you an idea of how we had that part A and the part B for the question, and then the final is on the right-hand side of what it looked like after we engaged patients. So we can see that we have more response options and asking the question in a different way. Next slide. And then the last example I have here is we wanted to understand meaningful treatment benefit. This is a term the FDA uses, and we understand that treatments, they might help, but does it really make a difference in the patient's life? And so we asked the question, are there things you want future MS treatments to help with or be helpful for? Because meaningful treatment benefit, we found out, does not resonate with patients. Some did find meaningful to be more personable, so they did like it. Others found that term confusing. So this was one of the more challenging items to find the right phrasing. We went through meaningful benefit or improvement, important benefit or improvement, significant improvement, improvement that makes a difference, noticeable improvement. And a participant with MS had said, well, this question offends me, because we had improvement in there at the time that we were testing. And of course, that was not the intent to offend anybody. And he said, I'm never going to improve with my MS, so I don't like this question. So we had to think about a different way to ask the question, getting at what we wanted to understand. So we combined the part A, the part B, and asked it in a different way, was what you see here. So if we go to the next slide, we can see what it looked like before and the after again, where we were trying to ask about important benefit and give an example of what that means, having the part A and the part B, but then we simplified it and asked about, is there something you want future treatments to help with or be helpful for? Next slide. There are some differences among the different versions of the survey. So as I mentioned, there's an asthma version, an MS, as well as a colorectal cancer. And if we go to the next slide, I'll show an example of formatting. It's a minor formatting change, but it did matter to patients. So in this particular example, we're asking about, did you, in the last 7 days, rate your experience with fatigue, pain, and there were additional list of symptoms. For MS, if you see in blue, that blue box there, we have the question asked with each symptom. And MS participants wanted this. They said, we experience brain fog, we get really tired. So really just having the question repeated, it keeps us focused and we can understand and answer accordingly of what you're looking for. However, when we got to asthma participants, they did not want the question repeated. They said, can you just write down the symptom and then put the question above just once? That's all we need. So there was some difference in preference of how the question was formatted here. Next slide. So overall, patient engagement is a must. The voice of the patient reports did help guide into some of the concepts that matter most, but then when we got down to the interviews, it provided richer data to complement those reports. Overall, the study involved 60 patients across the 3 conditions. We had 8 rounds of cognitive debriefing as well as usability testing together. And then for time to complete, the survey is quite long. It's about 32 minutes to an hour. And this might not be considered optimal by best practices because of respondent burden. But when asking patients about the duration, I asked, is there any questions we can remove if we really want to focus on what's most important? And they said, don't remove anything. They advised against it because the content is relevant and matters most to them. So they suggested instead, if you're worried about it being too long, too burdensome, just let us know up front, saying, this survey might take 60 minutes to complete, so then they can plan ahead. And then also, if it's online, you can have breaks, and so they can come back and complete it later. Next slide. And I'll hand it over to Anna.
Hey, everybody. I will go through my slides fairly quickly, so there's time for questions. I think both Joey and QALY covered really well a lot of the themes that you'll see here. So I just wanted to put kind of a patient spin and how we've used some of this in practice. So just here's a quick history of how we've engaged in value assessment going back to 2016, 2017. We were kind of thrust into that world when ICER did a review of RA drugs. And so we got a quick sort of on the ground education in sort of what it's like to engage in a value assessment. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more, but just fast forwarding to each kind of experience is built off of the next, or built into the next rather, all the way to where we are now, where we're using a lot of our history and data that we've collected to engage in sort of real world sort of policy experiences around value and assessment. So next slide. I'm going to zoom in on just a couple of these real quick. The deep dive here on the ICER review, I just want to highlight there were a number of ways that we engaged with ICER. We talked to them throughout. We provided comments. We were present at the sort of review meeting at the end, the voting meeting. But what I think was the most critical was doing a survey of our patient population, trying to develop a little bit more for the literature review of how patients experience their biologic medications for RA. Some of the sort of core findings I put here, one of the key things that I've taken away from this is that most patients don't find the first drug works for them completely. Most patients have to try multiple drugs for autoimmune diseases like rheumatoid arthritis before they find one that really works for them. And so that nuance was really important because you can do a head-to-head study that says, oh, well, this drug had a better efficacy in, X number of patients. But when you sort of zoom out and really collect that real world data, you might find that that patient had to try 2 or 3 other drugs before finding one that worked for them. That data is really important when you're determining that, what's going to go into that value assessment, and then ultimately how it's considered by payers and ultimately into coverage decisions. So, there were, I won't read all of this because you all can kind of look through it. But, we pulled out a specific example here to show, some of the percentages about what worked, what didn't. And, if you did have challenges accessing your medication because of perhaps it was step therapy, you had to step through 3 to 5, oftentimes is the number of drugs before getting one that works for you, that sort of thing. These are some of the consequences, which also matters a lot because then what you're experiencing is not only worsening of disease, but in many cases, comorbidities that are going to come along with it. So next slide. And then this one I wanted to call out too, because I thought this was really important. The Innovation and Value Initiative, which is now called the Center on Innovation, I believe. We worked with them starting in 2019. They had done an RA model when they first sort of organized as an organization in 2017. They realized that they needed to kind of go back to the drawing board because it wasn't patient-centered enough. And so they worked with us to organize a focus group of patients, and it was really eye-opening for them, but for us too. And I think that's why we feel so strongly about the patient perspective and value assessment, because I personally have sort of seen that aha moment and experienced it so many times from talking to patients. So these are some of the things that they found from the focus group that then was developed into a white paper a few years later. And a lot of this corroborates what you've already heard. Co-occurring conditions are very common and complicate outcomes. They also complicate clinical trial results, access to effective treatment, often driven by insurance coverage. And we all know kind of why that matters. And then, some of what people with RA want and expect, which may be different from what claims data or clinical trial data might tell you. So we also feel like that's really, really important because for some people, it's not just about symptom management. It's about, I have specific goals around independence, about being able to work productively and that sort of thing. One that really, I think, struck the IVI staff a lot that I continue to think is really important in conversations is stages that patients experience throughout their life journey. When you're talking about a chronic disease like arthritis, you're not talking about it in this episode of time, right? Like a year or 2 years. You need to think about it over the course of their lifetime and what is that patient going to experience? Hormonal changes was huge. So that's specific to women's health, but also for men, aging, things like that. So, and those are often triggers for symptom onset, treatment failures, treatment decisions. If you're a woman of reproductive age and you want to start a family, there are some biologic drugs that are indicated for pregnancy and others that are not. Those are really important considerations that need to be taken into account in those coverage decisions. Next slide. And just the last part of this kind of IBI findings, this it sort of puts on, when we talk about cost, this is a conversation that comes up a lot, I think, in patient circles. It's not just the direct costs. There's a lot of indirect costs that need to be taken into account as well. Obviously, time spent seeking and receiving and recovering from treatment, diminished workability, that comes up quite often. And it's not just because of your disease activity, it's also because of the time spent dealing with administrative barriers with your sort of coverage limitations. We see that an awful lot as well. There's the caregiver burden. I know that's really important to many people here. And of course, ancillary costs, transportation, things like that. Okay, next slide. So these are ways that we've used this data. I mentioned earlier, it's sort of a compounding effect. So we used all of that, those experiences, to then develop a position statement on patient-centered value assessment, which we now use often. Anytime we write a comment letter related to value assessment, we always plug that in. And I'm happy to kind of, in follow-up, put the link. But it talks about patient-centered methodology, the need to look beyond just the QALY and to use multiple methods, using real-world evidence, as we've talked about here, and some other things as well. We've used it most recently in the last couple of years in particular to engage with prescription drug affordability boards. We've done a lot of work in just kind of bringing the patient perspective as those boards in states are looking at essentially, value assessments for drugs, whether those drugs are deemed affordable or not, and whether they will apply upper payment limits to them. So we continue to engage there. We have detailed all of this data that we've talked about in our comment letters there, and have found it to be really helpful to kind of bring that patient perspective. And then engaging with CMS very similarly as they're looking at Medicare drug negotiations and maximum fair price methodology. We've used a lot of this data there as well. And then, of course, continuing to engage in advisory committees and other forums like this one. Okay, next slide. Key outcomes, one back, I think. There we go. So I just wanted to, I only have 2 slides left. So, but I just wanted to kind of highlight some of the outcomes, because what you may be thinking is, okay, it's a lot of work, a lot of hours, a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to do all of this. Is it worth it? What are the outcomes? So here are some of them. That ICER review I mentioned earlier, the final report did indicate that step therapy is not appropriate in all cases. I think that's really important, because it was that data that we collected showing the difficulty of patients finding a treatment that works for them that led to that conclusion. And I know that's been true for other groups as well. The white paper that we did with IBI, we've utilized that in many settings. I think that those findings are really, really important and hopefully instructive to others as they're going through value assessments. The engagement with PDABs we've talked about, but that certainly has led to improvements in patient engagement with a couple of them in particular that are a little further along. And we continue to use that even as just a building block for, hey, PDAB staff may, do you have a distribution list of patient groups to work with, and helping to serve as a connector? So it can be things sort of really little like that, and really large as well, and like in terms of like actually submitting methodology recommendations and things like that. And then I think overall is just adding to the literature, the use cases, and building on that value proposition of the importance of patient engagement. What we've talked about for many years now is, patient engagement should really be normalized as just part of the process. And I think the more time goes on and the more of us that engage, the more that is becoming true. Okay, last slide. Lessons learned. Okay, a single patient engaging in a value assessment review is insufficient. We've experienced this with 2 different ICER reviews now, and certainly ICER recognizes this as well, and we've talked about it with them. Not really sure how to solve for it, but when we've talked to patients who have engaged, if they're sitting there at that meeting, they feel the weight of the world on their shoulders. They feel like they're representing the entire disease community, and they want to be reflective as much as possible, but they're one person, right? So that's something that we're still kind of thinking about. How can we solve for that? There are, of course, physical and financial barriers to entry for patients themselves. You have the time and resources to fly to wherever that meeting is to participate, and for patient groups as well. Certainly connecting studies and surveys and things like that, requires resources. That said, as was said in the previous discussion, patients love having the opportunity to share their story. They want to feel like they are helping to kind of make the entire landscape better for themselves, but also for others in the next generation. And then putting in the,
yeah.
I think somebody needs to maybe mute.
I'm gonna get 4-1.
There we go. And then putting the hard work can pay off. It does result in tangible outcomes. I hope that this discussion has proved that. And then last but not least, I think our experiences are proof of concept that patient engagement is vital. And I hope that those here who maybe haven't really dipped their toes into those waters before are sort of convinced that it's worth it, and that all of us here are really eager to serve as a resource. And anytime, I'd always be happy to chat with anyone about what our experiences were like and just share some of our kind of tips and tricks. So with that, I will pass it back over to Omar, perhaps.
Thank you so much.
Whoever will be leading us in questions.
Thank you so much, Anna, Joey, QALY, for that wonderful presentation. I mean, your insights are just so valuable, and you're experts in this field for sure. And all of you have really highlighted the importance of patient engagement and the patient value into value assessment. So thank you so much. We do have a couple of questions. So the first question that we have is from Stephanie Vargas. She said, what are voice of the patient reports? Now that may be very common to some of us who are very familiar with that work, but QALY, you've mentioned that. So maybe if you'd like to take that question, please.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. So voice of the patient reports, the FDA started the patient-focused drug development initiative. And in 2012, they started conducting these voice of the patient meetings. And out of these meetings, they were held across conditions. And these reports came out to identify what is important to patients with regards to their symptoms, treatments. And these reports, they are listed on the FDA's website if you go to patient-focused drug development, and they have the whole list. And after the FDA started conducting these, other patient organizations thought this was a great idea and started conducting their own, and they're known as externally led meetings. And so they're still continuing on. And there's over, I believe, 100 of these reports or meetings that were had, and there's reports from these meetings available. So they're available free online, and so you can take a look at them. Hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you so much, QALY. And this question is for both Anna and Joey. So I'll go with Joey first. So Anna, I'll give you a break since you just finished. Joey, if you could create a value assessor landscape of your dreams in the US in particular, and knowing your role as an advisor to CMS, what would that look like? Would it be just one assessor, multiple, public, private? Your thoughts?
Oh, wow. That is a great question. And I need to practice this answer. I think the hardest part about this is that when a patient has a disease and is trying to make the best decision possible, they're focused on what they can do for their health. I think a lot of patients are concerned about what it does to other people too. And so I think we have we don't want to listen to the patient because we're like, well, it's a population thing and whatever. It's like, no, we kind of need both. And I actually think when you hear, if you let patients know that, when they're looking at these two treatment decisions, I think a lot of patients would take the cheaper, more cost-effective treatment at first and be perfectly fine with it, knowing that it allowed the overall budget to have more money to maybe treat a child with asthma or treat, you know what I mean? To have funds elsewhere. But for some reason, we have this idea that as economists and as administrators that we want to make this decision without it being more transparent. I think we need to be more transparent in what my decision to take a drug or use a drug and use my insurance, what does that do to the health plan? What does that do for our overall budget? Will that increase premiums next year? Those kind of things would help us, because I think we would then try to be better. Obviously, there'd be cases where we might have disagreements. There might be an experimental therapy that maybe the clinicians aren't as excited about, that a patient really wants to try because maybe they don't have any other hope and options. So I don't know if I'm dodging your answer a little bit. I think my thought is that there is no reason we can't make this simpler and more straightforward and honest, even if the honesty is sometimes difficult.
Thank you for that. And speaking of making things much easier, Anna, you spoke about the patient perspective. So what else do you wish that patient organizations knew before they engage in a value assessment? Sometimes they say, hey, you have a drug and here it is. What would you say?
Well, I think for value assessors specifically, I think if you buy into the value proposition of engaging patients, everything else will follow, including the ability for patient groups to be really prepared for engaging with the value assessors. So I think that, is really kind of the thing that we're driving towards, is that buy-in. For patient groups, I think it's really, if you are wanting to engage or needing to engage in a value assessment and you've not done that before, using the National Health Council's resources is always where I point people, the checklist, the things that make it really simple, and knowing that you can always connect to people who have done this before so that you don't feel like you have to go it alone or figure it out on your own.
Thank you so much, Anna. And thank you so much for giving that shout out to our wonderful tools and resources that we developed over the last several years on patient-centered value assessment. And as mentioned earlier, we do have a refreshed value classroom that we'll be launching the next several weeks. So stay tuned for that notification. But I want to say thank you again to all the wonderful speakers. And also, if you haven't registered for our upcoming webinars, where we'll be tackling all these alternatives to the QALY. One is on September 19th, September 26th, and October 2nd. I posted the link on the chat, but we will also be sending out communications. On behalf of the National Health Council, I really, again, thanks our speakers for giving and providing your insights and expertise, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.